Viking slavery. What was life like for a Viking thrall? Capturing slaves was one of the main reasons for the Viking raids. Along with the gold and silver they plundered or the Danegeld that was paid in so-called tribute, slaves were also a big economic incentive for the Vikings. But this doesn't mean that large portions of the people in Viking society were slaves. In fact, it's estimated that not more than 10% were slaves in the Nordic countries. This may sound like a lot, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but if you compare this to the Romans, the Greeks, and the Muslim slavery, it's not that much. In ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, up to 1/3 of the population is estimated to be slaves, in the Muslim world a little less. The Vikings of course captured many slaves on their raids, but most of these were sold on slave markets around Europe, in Africa, and in the Middle East. Sources have emerged from the Arab world, including the account of the 10th century geographer, Ibn Hawqwal, who in 977 AD, wrote of a Viking slave trade that extended across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. Evidence suggests the Vikings often targeted women and girls in their raids, indicating the existence of sexual slavery, as well as intermarriage. There are also indications that Vikings practiced polygamy, which in their highly stratified society would have meant that poorer unmarried men might have had limited access to women, and would have targeted female slaves as concubines, or even wives. So, how did people become slaves or thralls, as they were called by the Vikings? Let's find out. This is History with Magnus. There were 3 ways to become a thrall. The first was when the Vikings raided, they would capture and bring with them people from these raids. These people could be anyone, you just had to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It didn't matter whether you were a monk, soldier, farmer, or a child, if you weren't able to escape and weren't killed, you were captured and enslaved. The second way was being captured, in, or after a battle. If your side lost a battle against the Vikings, survivors who weren't injured would be enslaved. Those survivors who didn't fall into this category were killed. One should think that this made most of the thralls in Viking society men, but there were a higher number of female thralls taken by the Vikings than men. I will come back to that later in this presentation. The third way to become a thrall was being born a thrall. It didn't matter if the child was the owner's own son or daughter, if the mother was a thrall the child also was a thrall. It was up to the owner to decide what happened to the child when it was born. If there were need for more thralls, the baby would live and enter a life in servitude. If the owner didn't want a new slave, the baby was left out in the woods to die. But, it is also believed that some children who were the owner's own, was brought up as a normal Viking child. This depended on whether or not the father would acknowledge the child as his, which probably often did not happen. The thrall could own nothing, inherit nothing, and leave nothing. They were not paid of course, but in some circumstances, they were allowed to retain a small portion of the proceeds they obtained at the market, when selling goods for their owners. As a result, it was technically possible, though not often, for a thrall to purchase his or her freedom. They could also be manumitted, or released from thraldom, at any time, but how often this happened or not, we know very little about. The Vikings were of course, not the only ones who traded in slaves. Slaves were also traded in Western Europe, but there it was not common practice to sell fellow countrymen. The church was against Christians being forced into slavery by the heathen Vikings. One account describes how a monk was so shocked at seeing Christian slaves for sale in Hedeby, Sweden in 870, that he sold all his possessions and personally bought the slaves their freedom. The majority of thralls captured by the Vikings entered the wider network of trafficking and were transported to markets and points of sale in settlements across the Viking world and beyond, even reaching the emporias of Western Europe. Over time, Slavery became one of the main elements of the trade that developed during the Viking Age along the eastern rivers of European Russia and what is now Ukraine. DNA mapping of the modern Icelandic population found that up to two-thirds of Iceland's female founding population had Gaelic origins, either Ireland or Scotland, while only one-third had Nordic roots. The reverse was true for the male population, suggesting that many Nordic men in Iceland had children with women who were likely taken in raids from the British Isles. In 2010, it was also proven that at least one or two women, but maybe more, of Native American or Asian descent, had daughters in Iceland. I made a video about that, go watch that after you finish this. The Vikings were often brutal with those who had the misfortune to be captured. In one study, researcher Annik Gjellström of Stockholm University examined the skeletal remains of presumed Viking-era thralls found in graves in Scandinavia, and found that they showed signs of abuse and decapitation. Thralls were people without any personal rights. This is reflected, for example, in Norwegian legal language of the time, in which slaves and slave women are referred to, using the neuter gender. Neuter means a gender that refers chiefly, but not exclusively, to inanimate objects, neither masculine nor feminine. The masculine and the feminine gender, on the other hand, was used for free people. Slaves were seen as cattle, or as advanced domestic animals, who typically lived in the darkest end of the longhouse with the domestic animals, or in the stable. If slaves did not behave properly, they were beaten. An owner could punish his slaves as much as he wanted without any consequences. Punishment for thralls, who did something wrong, were harsh. Depending on the crime, the punishment started with whippings for minor offenses, but crimes like stealing, violence or escape attempts would be punished with cutting of the thrall's nose, ear or other body parts that didn't hinder you from doing work. Not only did this of course hurt tremendously, but it also showed everybody what you had done and what had happened to you. The thralls' bodies were also available for sexual exploitation. This is mentioned in the description from 922 by the Arabic diplomat, Ibn Fadlan, about his encounter with a group of Vikings on the Volga. He describes how two attractive girls, who were to be sold, were sexually abused by their owners, whilst others watched. He also witnessed a Viking funeral where a noble man was buried alongside a thrall girl. He writes, 6 men entered the pavilion and all had intercourse with the slave girl. They laid her down beside her master and 2 of them took hold of her feet, and 2 her hands. The crone, called the Angel of Death, placed a rope around her neck. She advanced with a broad-bladed dagger and began to thrust it in and out between her ribs, while the 2 men throttled her with the rope until she died. A thrall were often buried, sometimes alive, alongside their masters, and ended up as human sacrifices to accompany powerful Vikings into the afterlife. Not only were you a thrall in life, but you in this way became a thrall in the afterlife too. This time, for eternity. Especially attractive thrall girls and female prisoners of war of a high status could live in good conditions and achieve respect. The same probably also applied to male thralls, who were particularly skilled craftsmen. The thralls, of course, did all the hardest labor on the farm. They worked all day, often got only the leftovers for food, and could be beaten for the owner's pleasure. It has always sucked to be a thrall. A thrall could in some cases get their freedom. Well, I'm using freedom in a loose term here, because a freed thrall existed in the ambiguous space between enslavement and complete liberty. All freed men and women remained obligated to their former owners and were expected to support them, and they were never regarded as fully the equal of freeborn folk. Former thralls also had lower rights to compensation in legal disputes. The stone raised by Toki indicates his profession, a handy, useful occupation, but whether this was something new or a legacy of his former tasks as a thrall is unclear. The stone reads, Toki the blacksmith raised this stone to the memory of Thorgisel, son of Gudmund, who gave him gold and freed him. indicating that this former thrall had not only gotten his freedom, but also were given gold when he was freed. In time, the children and grandchildren of freed thralls would gain the full rights of the freeborn. Thraldom was later abolished by the church because it was seen as an ungodly thing to keep people in slavery. Well, that's of course what the church would like us to believe, but the truth is that thraldom was just replaced by another form of slavery, namely feudalism and serfdom. And a serf was a slave in everything but name. The serf was bound to the land, had to work 5 to 6 days a week on the landlord's farm and got only 1 or 2 days a week to work on the farm he so-called rented from the landlord. The abolishment of serfdom happened at different times in different countries, and in Russia it ended as late as 1861. So just like the Viking thralls, the serf could own nothing, inherit nothing, and leave nothing. I will be making more videos about the Vikings and other important historical events, so if you liked this presentation, please like, subscribe and share this video. And please leave a comment below and let me know what you think about the Vikings and thraldom, and also if there is a Viking topic you would like me to cover here on this channel. And I hope to see you in the next one. Skål!